Hello, everyone. How's it going? Cool. So is this all of us, do you think? Oh, yeah, well, they can find their way in. That's okay. Cool. So what did you guys have a lecture on this morning?
Economic analysis.
Economics which?
Economic analysis.
What was the topic of it, though? Like, what sort of stuff were you guys doing there? Incentives, screening. Oh, yeah. Well, that's semi-related to this. So they've put together these topics sort of in the vein of these are good things to go through, and they're not necessarily related to what we've done in the morning. But if you see any relations you'd like to discuss or anything, just yell out. So my name's Matt Nolan. I am an economist at IRD. But if you need to contact me about something that's discussed here, so just email me here. Cool. Before being an economist at IRD, I was a private sector economist, which is probably the main reason why I'm in here to talk about this. I also did my PhD on measuring income inequality. So, income inequality is a topic that gets a lot of attention, is being talked about a lot, and that a lot of people say doesn't really get discussed in economics. I'm going to point out why that's a load of trash, why it's a central concept that comes within how we think about economics in general, and how all these different measures you see that describe this, what they actually mean, what they embed, what they're trying to represent, and how we can think about using those measures for ourselves when we want to talk about, a given policy problem or a given, social problem or even a problem within our business, because they'll relate to ethical principles and ways of thinking about what outcomes are that we don't necessarily get when we just think about averages or we just think about the level of GDP by itself. So what is income inequality and why do we care? Generally, when we do this exercise, we're going to think about situations such as when there's one person with $1, another person with $2, another person with $3, okay? Now, if we were to talk about the average level of income, something that would be represented by GDP per capita, say, we would just average over these and we would get $2. And we would say something that increases that we might perceive as good, but economics itself doesn't tell you whether that's good or bad. The goal of economics is just to describe what can happen in different situations, and then when we have those descriptions, there's actually a whole nother process of trying to figure out whether we think that's a good or bad thing. So if we doubled everyone's income here, it would go to, let's do a different color, it would go to $2, $4, and $6. The average of that would go to $4. It would double as well, and we'd say, oh, okay, that looks cool. For some reason, we think that's good. That income might refer to more consumption, more things that people value, but it might refer to the fact that prices have gone up and it might mean nothing at all, okay? So at this point, these are just numbers that we can look at. Now, when we talk about inequality, we're saying, okay, this $2 doesn't tell us about these individuals and the distances between them. So we want to think about that as well. When someone has $1, someone else has $2, someone else has $3, there's a $1 difference between each of them. Here, there's a $2 difference. So we might look at this situation and say there are larger gaps between people and we're concerned. In the same vein, though, everyone's income has doubled here. The fact that it's doubled means that proportionally, this person gets a half of that person, this person is getting 2/3 of this person, and the same ratios hold here. And we might say, well, in that case, we might not have a concern. Now, in order to think through that, we need to be asking, what do we think about those concepts? How are those concepts represented in measures? And what has actually driven that difference? What has driven the change? Not just the difference that we started with, but the difference if something changes. Now, why do we often hear that economists ignore inequality? It's because people want things that are easy to talk about, things that are easy to represent. An average is something that's very easy to just say. Okay? You can say that and you can think about progress by saying that has doubled. But having to think about how this is distributed, represent that, gets more complex. It's not a nice, neat soundbite that a journalist can take, and so they focus on when economists describe that. But the economics you'll be learning and the economics that often gets described is just as fixated on the distribution as it is on the average. Okay? So when we talk about inequality, you'll get all these people that say putting inequality in economics is a new idea, okay? And they're just people that haven't read anything properly or like selling you something. Inequality is as old an economic analysis as economic analysis is itself. So some people would have heard about Adam Smith being the founder of economics. When he wrote his book, and when you go through the 2 volumes that are involved, The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he talked about the distribution of wealth and income a lot. When you go even further back, you go to back in the day with Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and Xenophon. When they described economic phenomenon, they were focused on households, and they had an idea about inequality there. They would talk about wealth inequality as being corrosive to the environment, as affecting political situations and leading to disorder, etc., etc. And so when you go through and see how people talked about economics and how they talked about averages, they were always then also thinking there's some type of income distribution, and they were saying that this might have some consequence as well. So the modern discussions that come out of that are really not that much different from the ones we had in ancient Greece. And no doubt ones that were before that, they just weren't written down. So this is actually a very natural topic for us to all be interested in. And if we're being good economists or doing good economic analysis, we should be asking about inequality just as much as we ask about averages as well. Now, what we need is a framework to do that. What economists like to do are not make conclusions, not actually figure anything out, but come up with a framework so people can embed their judgments in there, and from that determine, hey, this is what I care about, therefore I feel this way about different outcomes. So, to sort of think about some of those values, we're going to start with a game. Now, I had a lot more blab about history here, but it's not that interesting, so I'm going to go straight to that. I have different pieces of paper here, and that will mean that we have 2 different types of players. Will it come up on the slide, or does it? No, I'll explain the game. Cool. So I need people to be in pairs. Do we have even numbers around? If we don't, Golnara will be one of the numbers, I'm sure. So here, I'll give everyone in the pair a nice different color. Ooh, here we go.
What color are you?
Me.
Don't talk into my partner here.
Ah.
Oh, you're orange. But can't guess what color.
Sure. Here you go.
Trick question.
It's close, yeah, that is. It's eggplant-ish. Yeah, okay. I was just judging by your cleverness of answer. You said purple. I was like, oh, okay. Try something a little more careful.
Sure.
Violet.
But you went with Abergene, which is actually like that.
There we go.
Thank you.
And now it looks like it is nice and even. Very good. Whew. Oh, good.
Light purple like that.
So the idea here is that the people in orange are making the first play of what's going on. The people that have an orange tag, okay, they know that there's a situation where they can turn around and decide what the other person is going to get in this little game, okay? And they can write down a number, and the other person decides then whether to accept it or not, which they'll put down on their little piece of paper. Now, the trick is that the person with the orange piece of paper will receive 1 magical pretend point minus what they offer, okay? The other player, if they accept, receives the offer, okay? But if they reject it, everyone gets nothing, okay? If the person with the purple piece of paper rejects the offer, then both people get nothing at all, okay? And your goal here is to make as much magical pretend currency as possible, right? So let's start off and see what orange will offer. Remember, if purple rejects your offer, you get nothing, okay? So let's give that a go.
What's the pretend currency? Anything?
Oh, you can pretend it's whatever. It could be a euro. It could be a Disneyland dollar.
Bitcoin.
Yeah, it could be a Bitcoin.
We're going to make an offer.
So does that mean the offer is always $1 or
You're going
less?
to offer up to $1.
Yeah, I mean, if you offered more than $1, then you'll be making a negative amount. So you would definitely lose.
Yeah.
I mean, you could if you really felt like it. Yeah. Cool. Have all the oranges made offers? It's if you want more time to consider, think about it. Draw the little game theory tree if you've been doing game theory. That's all fine. Cool. Once you have done your orange, pass it over to the other player, to the person with the purple who's in your pair.
Can I borrow a pen?
Oh, I do have it.
Oh, wait, what?
Okay.
And then we say yes or no on the purple.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I did think about just using one piece of paper, but I thought two might make it feel more inclusive. I don't know.
I reject your offer.
Boom.
That's it.
Do we tell
Wait, no,
the
we have a deal.
person
You got more utility.
if I reject your offer, like we got like
What?
is what you nominate?
Ah,
That's a good point. If it's repeated, it's quite different.
I get one as
But in this case, it's just a one-shot game.
right? So really, we have equal amounts now, and that's why you accepted an offer.
okay, let's accept your higher offer.
Because I could have said 40 cents. You could have
Now I
said,
get 60.
Okay, sure.
or you could have said,
You get 35.
well, potentially. But that's
Right.
sort of open environment.
Originally, I was not going to accept that.
You could have, I mean, I could have taken the risk and just said, give you 10 cents.
Since you showed
Oh, I'm just letting everyone have a chat about their offers. But how about once you're finished, put up your hand, just so I can tell everyone's done. Is everyone done with offers and acceptance? Yes, yes. You guys as well? Yeah. No? No. Negotiating? No negotiating. So, I mean, I can, if you want to negotiate for the rest of the day, that's fine. We don't need everyone to have finished. What I will say is who had an accepted offer? Cool. Could people say the amount that they offered?
50 cents.
50 cents, 50 cents?
65 cents.
65 cents, wow. $2. So someone made a negative amount there. Player one. That's cool. So no one offered zero who was accepted? No one offered a millionth of a cent and was accepted? No? Yeah. Well, was anyone rejected? What happened with the rejection?
After 49 cents.
Oh, that was rejected. Whew.
I rejected him at 60 cents.
Oh.
Because we learned earlier today that a higher willingness to pay actually equates to higher utility and happiness. So, I did it for him.
Ah, interesting. So, if we were going to be little strict automatons that just thought about our own payoff and didn't think about anyone else around us, then the Nash Equilibrium for this game, I think you guys have done game theory, right? So you've heard that term. Nash Equilibrium for this game is that the first player offers the minimum amount possible towards zero, so 0.000, or if it has to be in cents, 1 cent. But I want to leave it super open so people could just do whatever they wanted, negative amounts, huge amounts. They'll offer 1 cent, and the person will accept it because 1 cent's better than nothing, right? So if you're willing to reject a cent, then you're immediately saying, I value the fact that this is a fair transaction in some way, okay? You're saying, yeah, I might have a cent if I accept and nothing otherwise, but this is complete trash. I want to see you burn, right? And that could be a vengeful thing. I just enjoy seeing people hurt. It could be, this is unfair and I don't think that's just. It could be the two people don't get along very well. It could be that you expect the game to be repeated in the future, as was raised over here, and therefore you want to show, hey, if this comes up again, you're going to offer me a better buddy, right? So there are all these ways of thinking about it. When they do these games in like trials, behavioral economics trials, they tend to find offers between 30 cents and 50 cents. And those tend to get accepted. Offers below 30 cents often get rejected, even though the equilibrium of the game, if we're thinking in a strictly rational sense, where all rational means is that we're ignoring some of the preferences, okay? It's not something that's too harsh to say. We're just saying we're ignoring this fairness preference. We're ignoring this vengeance preference or any such thing. So this game's called the ultimatum game. And the ultimatum game helps us think about how there is some desire for fairness that's there. Now, when I talk about fairness, though, does anyone have a bit of a concern? How is this related to how we might think about fairness over the whole economy? Does anyone think that this is a weird comparison or have issues with that they want to bring up? There's no wrong answers, by the way, so feel free to go for it.
So is the question about fairness?
Yeah, I mean, does this really represent a preference for fairness over everyone by itself? Not the fact that sorry, my question was terrible. The fact that people often offer 30 to 50 cents or else they reject, as compared to the equilibrium where it's only 1 cent, does that tell us something about fairness in general? Oh, no. Let's have a look around. So, I mean, yes and no are both correct answers here, okay? As when I was blabbing on about the idea of vengeance and everything.
Right
Is it? It's over here?
Lanyard, is that it?
No.
No, sorry.
I think you swiped it to open the door earlier, but then did you put it back in wall? Carla was here. Maybe she does it. Anyway, thank you.
Au revoir. Yeah, we've had our game. It was beautiful. Oh, well, here's a bunch of explanation. Okay, yes, and the question I was just asking turns up right at the bottom. So these things are both true. It is showing a preference for fairness in terms of your own relationships with people. You value being treated fairly yourself, all right? But what happens if we're looking at random people on the street? Do we care whether they're treated fairly, and should we? So to get to sorry.
I have a question. So the reason I made the offer that I made was because the rules of the game were very, very clear, and no rational person would have accepted anything less than that, because they know that until we actually get to a more or less equal position, they could keep rejecting it, the offer, in essence. And neither of us get anything as a result. So
although there wasn't so much a negotiation there. The person can just choose to accept or reject. And I see where you're coming from, but I've seen people accept 1 cent. I mean, it can happen. And that's the thing. And we had 65 cents over here, right? This was over fair. And all these things are completely legitimate. Yeah. And they come from a perception about how people value different types of fairness, how people, understand the game and what they expect is going to come next. If they expect it to be... So a bargaining would be repetition. If you expect repetition, it definitely makes sense to offer more. So, I mean, saying that the Nash Equilibrium is 1 cent is not to say that offering something different is wrong. I remember the first time I played the Prisoner's Dilemma, where the Nash Equilibrium is to narc on the other person. I didn't narc. I was like, the other person will surely be a nice person. I'm from Otrahonga. Everyone's friendly. We all have trust in each other. And this Wellington boy just narked immediately. And I was like, oh, man. But this helps us understand these choices and how norms are formed to try to coordinate actions given those. Now, and that's a good point to raise, because you're saying that there's some norm there that led you to think that was the right sort of offer to make and that worked for the game, and that came out as a preference for fairness as well. And the thing is, if we stand back and we take ourselves out of this game and we see people in society walking around, we might still have a preference for fairness in their actions, either because we might say we would like to live in a fair world, or we might say if I wasn't in this world right now, but I could become any random person, okay, I could just drop in and become that person, I would want a world that's relatively fair rather than a world that's filled with people who are very poor and other people that are very rich. Because the world where we're all sort of in a similar position, you know, I can still live a relatively good life. If I accidentally end up in the terrible position, that will be bad. And so that's John Rawls' veil of ignorance. Okay. And behind that veil of ignorance, we can use these ideas from the ultimatum game and thinking about our personal preference for fairness and norms, and we can apply them to society more broadly. So when we talk about it this way, there's a definite preference there. And in the same way that you'll constantly hear people talk about incomes and GDP, and how there's an amount of GDP that goes up, and that higher income, we can buy more consumption goods for it. And that same way, because there's a preference not just for consuming, but for how that's distributed, we can say that income inequality is something else we want to consider when thinking about different ways income is generated and allocated across a society. So that's where all the economics-y stuff comes in. Now, how do we actually show this? We just talked about some ideas, but we want to represent these incomes. Now, when we're not just looking at average GDP or total GDP, we're recognizing there's heaps of people. Okay, there's lots of people walking around here. Okay, these people all have different incomes, and we want to think, how can we represent a distribution of the incomes of those individuals, given there is so many of them? Now, before drawing the curves here, I'm going to draw one up here. We have our friends who are earning $1, $2, $3. Okay, I can just do a graph of this. So I go over here. Amount of dollars, I got some people. Now, if I order these people from the very poorest to the person with the highest income, then I'm saying, okay, I've got a $1 here, a $2 over here for our second person, and a $3 over here for our third person. Okay? Nice. We can draw a line through it. If there's lots of people, it's going to look like that. That should be a straight line, but I'm not very good at lines. And as a result, we have a graph. Cool. What's the point? This thing here is what we can do when we have information on all of individuals' income. And generally, when we look at this, we get something that looks a lot like this. Okay? People at the very, very top tend to have much, 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 much higher incomes. It will follow some sort of Pareto law or look exponential in some way. And so this diagram is called the parade of dwarves. There's a few people at the end that tower above everyone else. Now, one thing that can be misleading about this is often the density that's in here is a lot larger than these people at the end still. There's a lot more income over this group. It's just there's some people at the end that just have quite substantive incomes. Okay. And this is a description of how the distribution would look. Now, if people go back to authors like Aristotle and see them waxing lyrically about how wealth inequality is toxic and how we shouldn't have inequality in that way, it's important to remember that Aristotle's talking from a perspective of an existing hierarchy where he sees some type of inequality as being fair. To him, kings and nobles required much, much larger income because they had some intrinsic responsibility to take care of what was going on, yada, yada, yada. So even he was pushing for massive, massive inequality as long as it represented the hierarchy. Okay? So understanding these types of distributions in these graphs requires assumptions about what it reflects back to. And when you read a lot of old authors, okay, you would have them talking in a way that sounds very egalitarian but wasn't. Okay? You go back to the scholastics in the Middle Ages, they still believed that royalty should have much, much more income than everyone else because they're gifted from God to come here and protect us all sorts of trash like that, right? And understanding why that distribution exists and where it comes from, and then in turn, if something was to happen to redistribute it and change it, and what that would lead to in terms of outcomes, is what we're trying to do with these distributions. We're not trying to make calls about what's wrong or right, because you know what? Every single one of you will have different views, and all of them are correct, given the moral judgments that you make. Economists aren't very good at doing that. They're only good at drawing graphs to try to represent what's happening. Now, there's a line here on this board I also want to talk about. So I'm going to take the same example, and over here, I'm going to write cumulative income, and down here, number of people again. Now, what does cumulative mean? We're going to start with the same order, so we start with the very poorest person, and we're going to say, okay, their income is $1, the income of the person before them is nothing, so down here, $1. Right here. Then we're going to go over to the next person, their income is $2. The income of all the people before them is $1. Therefore, the cumulative income is $3. So here, 1, 3. Then we're going to go over here, and we're going to say, rightio, this person gets $3. They're the third person. The person before them gets 2 and 1. So this is 6. Okay. Now, we get a curve that is not supposed to look like this, because again, I'm terrible at lines. Oh yeah, the spaces between these are awful. Let's drag this one back. So it should be the same space across, but up here. There we go, much better. Aha. Okay. Because I've done such a terrible job, I'm going to draw it again. People, cumulative income, dot. Right. So this represents how cumulative income changes. Now, if we change this cumulative income to be the proportion of total income, okay, proportion, and this over here to be the proportion of total people, then we know this endpoint is 1. Rightio. Now let's think of another thought experiment here. What happens if we took this $1, $2, $3 and we took it off everyone? All right, they lost all their income, and then we gave them back the average of what's left. Now the average of what's left is this $2. Well, that first person will now have $2. Okay, the second person has $4, and the last person has, the second person has 2, the last person has 6. So we go 2, 4, 6. And we get a nice straight line. That's straight. This is hard without measuring things. Luckily, on this, we have the ideas. So, that line where we took everyone's income and gave them all back the same amount was called the line of complete equality. Now, if you go and listen to other people lecture about inequality, generally when people study inequality, it's because they're really fired up about it. Now, I'm fired up about lots of things, but I studied it because it was being talked about a lot. I really want to understand it. Complete equality doesn't mean complete fairness. Okay? And we're going to really focus on that here. Having completely equal outcomes between people can actually be very unfair. And if you have different moral judgments, you'll view it relatively differently. Now, the Lorenz curve represents the distribution as it is. So, we have 2 lines. One where we represent the income that we talked about, and one where every person had exactly the same income. Now, one thought experiment that comes up a lot when we talk about what's happening here is this concept called Okun's leaky bucket. So, with Okun's leaky bucket, we can imagine a situation where there's a well, and that well has water in it, and this person has all that water. Okay, they can do what they want with that water and enjoy it. If you go and stick a bucket in that well and then try to give it to someone else who's very thirsty, they don't have any water, that's cool, whatever. But if the bucket's leaky, you're going to lose some of the water on the way. So it could be that there's holes in the bucket because it's old. It could be that there's loss from the bucket because it's a hot day and water evaporates, even though the bucket's fine. In those contexts, you end up losing some water. And we can ask ourselves, how much water would we be willing to lose for that transfer to happen? So often when we go and compare these types of distributions, we're asking ourselves, what is our preference for fairness relative to Okun's leaky bucket? And this is where people will often talk about a trade-off between incomes and inequality. Now, I want to be sort of careful with that example, because we haven't explained where inequality and incomes can come from, what the actual causes of those things are. Okun's leaky bucket only tells us that because we have a perception where we view fairness as something that's relevant for policy, where we see fairness as something that's relevant when we want to live within a society, when we see fairness as relevant when we're doing things with our neighbors, because of that, we might be willing to have some trade-off between how much income we end up with and how fairly that's distributed. And it's just supposed to represent that as a thought experiment. It could be that the thing generating inequality is something that also reduces incomes. It could be that you have these massive monopolies that generate huge amounts of rent, and as a result of that, incomes are very unequal and they don't have the incentive to produce as much. Okay? Have you guys done monopolies and stuff yet in the course? Yeah, so if you've got an economy filled with monopolies, then actually things that could break that could lower inequality in incomes and increase incomes overall. So it's not saying there's always going to be a trade-off. It's saying this is a useful thought experiment to think about what we would be willing to sacrifice as a society in order to make incomes more equal. Now, we're going to get back to redistribution at the end. What I want to do here is talk about these things called Lorentz dominants, in case you ever hear someone say them. So, you will have noticed that with this curve, it's always equal to 1, right? The completely equal curve is equal to 1 at this point. The Lorentz curve is equal to 1. When you have Lorentz dominance, you are talking about a Lorentz curve that's doing something like this, your good friend, the line of complete equality, doing this, and a new Lorentz curve that's like this. Okay, that's all inside the previous one. Now, in this case, what's happening? As this new Lorentz curve is moving towards the line of complete equality, you're saying that the sum of income is a greater proportion of total income all across here. For that to happen, people that are on lower incomes, specifically since they're the same to this point and then expand, people from here must be earning more income. Think about the way we describe this Lorentz curve. The slope of it, okay, the increase each time was the individual's income. This is cumulative income, and so the increase each time is the individual's income. When the curve gets steeper, that means a person at that position is now getting more income. So when this curve gets like this, there must be some redistribution from somewhere at the top towards somewhere in the middle here, or if it came up early, at the bottom. Now, generalized Lorentz dominance takes this Okun's leaky bucket example and applies it to this. Instead of talking about proportions, we put cumulative income at the end. Because we have cumulative income, we can actually get a situation where the curves end up at different points. So, if you reduced inequality, but that reduced the total amount of income, you would have something that looks like this in a generalized Lorentz diagram. Okay, so over here, cumulative income peeps. We have our initial curve, which goes up to total income. And then we have some new amount where total income is lower, but the Lorentz curve is flatter. For kicks, we're going to make it completely equal, so a nice, almost completely straight line. Okay. Now, in this case, there's a trade-off between the two distributions. We would observe this happening. We might be looking at two different countries. We might be looking at a situation where we've built a model of the economy, and this describes what the income distribution would look like if these policy changes were put in place. So in this situation, there's a trade-off because there are individuals that are made distinctly worse off due to income being lower. And it's not just the people out here. It's the entire point where these curves are getting closer to each other because this is flatter. Now, in this situation, given that trade-off, we would need to ask ourselves about our preference for equality. If all we cared about was equality, then we would prefer this curve here. If all we cared about was average income, we would prefer this curve over here. And this is how economists will conceptualize trade-offs between policies and trade-offs between things when we think about distributions. Now, that's nice for economists, but is that the only way that income inequality matters? So there is one thing here that I'll point out before we get started on just discussing that. When we talk about things this way, we need some pretty big certainty about how things will change if we introduce a policy. Economists don't have any idea, not because they're dumb, but because these things are super complicated, okay? Because these things are difficult. They try to tease out using data what they can, but it's hard to even get the data that you need to think about things. But given this description, is there any way you think that there are things missing from how we describe inequality here and how we might talk about it? So feel free to spitball whatever you think.
Reframe the question one more time, please.
Sure thing. Given this way of talking about income inequality, right? We've taken a whole bunch of individuals, taken their incomes, we've lined them up. Do you think there are things missing in how this describes why we might care about inequality? Right? I've just taken a bunch of people, I've said, you've got $2. I'm going to put you on this graph, okay? Can you think of ways that just doesn't, you feel like there are things missing from that description to you?
Like, wealth means one thing to one person, but not to another.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually not taking into account their financial needs.
Different, what, sir?
Different individuals will have different financial needs.
Yeah, yeah.
But net worth, I mean, net income and net worth are totally different things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Contribution towards the GDP in the first place. So
Mm-hmm.
someone at the lower end is not contributing that much towards the GDP, while some individual in the middle might be contributing a bit more,
Mm-hmm.
taking different roles or something.
And also that person in the middle may be contributing quite significantly to how that person at the other end is getting.
Mm-hmm.
Pay contributions.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Right. Do we have any other feelings? I mean, these are all correct. These are all good, right? But we're allowed to think that there are other things that matter. Yeah, so you would have seen a lot of criticisms of GDP and talking about like GDP per capita. And this is the same sort of thing again, right? But we're talking about the spread of it.
I don't know really what it is, but is it got anything to do with the productive boundary?
The productive boundary. So the productive frontier captures elements of what we're describing, but it's also something I like to avoid a bit unless we're sitting there doing Edgeworth boxes and then noting that it's really hard to actually measure. In this context, there are elements of that, but I think we can think about it very much in terms of the household. And so thinking through when we're describing a household, what are some of the things missing in this? Okay? Now,
Well-being distribution.
yeah.
Oh, if we're talking about household, are you saying that now the x-axis is household?
No, it's individuals.
Okay, so yeah, some individuals are dependent on the incomes of other individuals, and so there's a higher need to earn more to take care of more people that can't work, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then people that can't work might one day be people that are currently unhelpful.
Yeah. Yep. So we have captured a lot of the topics that are going to come up later, so that's great. Okay, but I'll also make sure I give us the specific names for different things as we go through them. I just want to give us a chance to actually say stuff. I hate the idea that I'd sit here just talking about here's an income distribution, do this, without you being able to say, I've got issues with this representation. Because, you know, that's how this can be. There's so many terms and such a way of doing things that it can strangle the way we conceive a problem. Now, before we have our break, I just want to introduce terms for thinking about what's going on here. So when we described this Lorenz curve, okay, now generalized Lorenz curve, we let it differ a little bit, but when we described the Lorenz curve itself, we acted as if we were playing that ultimatum game. There was a fixed bounty, and we were talking about how it could be distributed between people. Now, on top of that, we might have equity principles that are beyond just saying let incomes be equal for individuals that drive how we're thinking. So I want to make sure we can outline those. Equity. Okay, we have two people making coffees that are exactly the same type of coffee. They're both just as good at being a staff member. They're both just as nice to customers. Customers are just as willing to pay as much when they're there, but they receive very different wages. Okay? Now, in this instance, we might look at that, noting that they seem to be performing the same task, doing the same sorts of things, be in the same situation themselves, and noticing they're remunerated differently, we might say this looks like discrimination. Okay? It could be that the two baristas were different genders. It could be that they were ethnically different, and that was driving what was happening. That's immediately a form of discrimination. It could just be that one of the baristas met the owner before the other one, and then due to that relationship having formed over time, they've just done a bit better. That still is working as a form of discrimination. Now, we call this horizontal inequity. Two people who are in the same situation are being treated differently. Now, if we were to look instead at the owner of the cafe and a barista, and we noted that the owner of the cafe received a higher income than the barista, that's not horizontal inequity. They're doing different things. They might come from a situation with different needs. And as a result, a difference in income might be justified in some way. However, that doesn't mean it's endless or it could go anywhere. So when we see that difference between people who are different, okay, and that difference seems to be related to the income they could or should earn in some conception, we would call that vertical inequity. Oh, there's words over there. I couldn't see them coming up. So why are incomes different? They could be different because of risk-taking, experience and investment, and preferences, okay? Your cafe owner is taking on a lot of risk. It could be another COVID situation, and they wouldn't be able to earn income, et cetera, et cetera. And in order to get them to set up that cafe, to take on that capital expenditure, they have to be remunerated for it. As a result of that, you could have differences in income that seem perfectly justifiable. It could be differences in experience and investment. In the top case, it could well be the case that the first person has been working for longer, they've built up more of a relationship with the owner, more of an understanding of the customers. We thought they were equal, but they weren't. Or in the latter case, we know that the cafe owner sat there, sacrificed a bunch of their consumption to buy cafe equipment, to buy your machine that does the coffee stuff, to rent the premises and all that jazz. Maybe they bought it, maybe they built it. In that case, those things might seem to justify a difference in remuneration. And then when we've got preferences, we're admitting that people are different, and some people are really, 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 really unwilling to do work because it really sucks for them, okay? Because it's painful for them to do, or specific types of work. As a result, they'll accept a lower wage to do something that doesn't put that pressure on them. They're allowed to do that. They're allowed to. The question is so much them making that choice, it's just, did they have the opportunity to go off and do something else if they deemed that that's what they wanted to do? And people do have very different preferences, and as a result, different incomes for that reason also seems okay. But, we can't actually observe a lot of these things. We're talking about hypothetical concepts where differences in income are okay, but it's not like we can go to the data and find it. They can look similar to forms of discrimination or where there are differences in people's underlying opportunity to go off and do something. Now, in those two cases, we would say that the difference in income seems relatively unjust. Now, to come back to the point of, hey, what happens if a person needs to be rewarded a certain way in order to go off and work in a job that's very high value? Your doctor, it might be very rare for someone to be a doctor, to have the underlying ability to be a doctor, to get the training to be a doctor. And so we need to remunerate them more so that they go off and do that role, because otherwise that activity wouldn't happen at all. That's a legitimate way to think about there being income inequalities. But we need to think about that along multiple levels, okay? Firstly, yes, we can understand that there might be a higher wage in order to incentivize them to do that work, and that might lead to a more efficient outcome, provide services to those customers. But why was that person able to get that training? How do we think about the situation where people have the intellect and ability to do those things in the first place, okay? Is that actually a difference in opportunity? Now, this becomes much starker when we think about people that definitely do struggle with opportunities in the labor market. Someone with a very heavy disability has their opportunities limited in the labor market, and we can proactively try to increase opportunity in some way, but they're unlikely to end up with the same opportunities that someone who isn't in that situation would have. All right? Now, knowing there are these trade-offs, we have to be honest when we're accepting a situation where someone won't have those opportunities, and we have to be able to describe it and think about policies clearly. And people can have different views on it, which is why you will get disability advocates saying quite different things to people that don't talk about that stuff. And it's also one of the areas where these numbers can be incredibly misleading. Okay? Because if you have someone that has a substantially larger need for the funds in order to live a certain quality of life, then just observing that they have the income to get that consumption doesn't necessarily tell us that we would want to redistribute away from them. Cool. So the thing we can take from this, where are we? Aha. The thing we can take from this is there is a fair level of inequality, okay? If someone shows you an inequality number, it doesn't tell us much. Someone that's saying we need to eradicate inequality is insane, okay? Because they don't understand that people have differences and people have different desires. But what they might mean is something quite different. They might mean that, hey, we're in a situation where people do have discrimination or a lack of opportunities, and we want to deal with that. Now, if anyone's done like, what's that, like diversity or discrimination training or implicit bias training, you'll notice that these terms are a little bit different, okay? So the horizontal inequity is often called discrimination in that training. Vertical inequity is called equity. Equality in that training is not the same as equality here, because equality there is very minimal. It's just treating people the same way. It comes into discrimination, when equality in economics is actually about having the same outcomes. It's this line here. Now, the economic literature is very old. This is the words they're used here. But we have to be careful that the way we use terms here and the way they're used in other disciplines can be different. And that's why I've spent a bunch of time banging on about it. Cool. So we're now right on for a 10-minute break. So feel free to use the toilet.